Something fundamental just shifted in the American economic landscape, and most people haven't noticed yet. Oracle, a company worth over $300 billion, has officially relocated its headquarters out of California. On its own, that might seem like a corporate decision. But Oracle isn't alone. Over the past few years, a growing list of major corporations, Tesla, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Charles Schwab, and others, have quietly done the same thing. This isn't a temporary trend or a pandemic-era quirk. It's a pattern that's accelerating, and it raises a question that should concern anyone paying attention to where this country is headed economically. What happens when the state that has defined American innovation for half a century starts losing the companies that built it? California isn't just any state. It's the fifth largest economy in the world. And right now, the foundations of that economy are being tested in ways that will reshape not just the West Coast, but the entire balance of economic power across the United States. So let's talk about what's actually happening here, because this isn't just about one budget cycle or one political party. This is about a fundamental shift in how California operates, and more importantly, how sustainable that operation really is. For decades, California has been sold to the world as the exception to the rule. While other states worried about balanced budgets and fiscal conservatism, California was supposed to prove that you could have it all. World-class universities, cutting-edge infrastructure, comprehensive social programs, and still maintain the fifth largest economy on the planet. The narrative was simple and it was compelling. California wasn't just surviving with high taxes and expansive government, it was thriving because of them. The state was an economic powerhouse that could afford to be generous, progressive, and ambitious all at once. But here's where that story starts to crack. The California economy isn't actually structured the way most people think it is. Unlike Texas or Florida, which have relatively diversified tax bases spread across multiple industries and income levels, California has built a revenue model that's almost shockingly dependent on a very small group of people. We're talking about the top 1% of earners, the ultra-wealthy tech executives, venture capitalists, and successful entrepreneurs who generate massive capital gains when they sell stock or when their companies go public. These individuals don't just pay a large share of the state's income tax, they pay the majority of it. In some years, the top 1% has contributed more than 50% of all personal income tax revenue. Think about that for a second. Half of the state's main funding source comes from a tiny sliver of the population. Now, you might say, that's fine. Tax the rich, fund the programs, everyone benefits. And in theory, that makes sense. But in practice, it creates a system that's incredibly volatile. When the stock market is booming and tech companies are going public left and right, California's coffers overflow. The state suddenly has billions in surplus, and politicians from both parties start announcing new programs, expanded benefits, and long-term commitments. But when the market corrects, when tech stocks tumble, when IPOs dry up, that revenue vanishes almost overnight. And because so much of the budget is tied to ongoing commitments like pensions, healthcare, and education funding, the state can't just scale back proportionally. You end up with these massive swings from surplus to deficit, and the structural spending never really adjusts to match reality. This isn't a new problem. California has been riding this roller coaster for years. During the dot-com boom of the late 90s, the state was flush with cash. Then the bubble burst, and suddenly, there was a fiscal crisis. The same thing happened during the housing boom in the mid-2000s. Revenue poured in, spending increased, and then the financial crisis hit, and the state nearly went bankrupt. Jerry Brown, who served as governor twice, spent much of his second tenure trying to build up reserves precisely because he understood this pattern. He pushed for fiscal restraint, advocated for a rainy day fund, and warned constantly about the dangers of overspending during good times. And for a while, it worked. California built up a substantial reserve, the budget looked stable, and the doom and gloom predictions seemed overblown. But then the pandemic happened, and everything changed again. The federal government pumped trillions of dollars into the economy, much of it flowing through California. Tech companies saw unprecedented growth as the world went digital almost overnight. Remote work became standard, e-commerce exploded, and the stock market defied all expectations. California's tax revenue surged to record levels. In 2021 and 2022, the state was projecting surpluses in the tens of billions of dollars. Governor Newsom announced rebate checks for residents, new spending on homelessness initiatives, expanded healthcare coverage, and ambitious climate programs. The message was clear. California was back, stronger than ever, and ready to lead the nation into a new era of progressive governance. Except the foundation of that surplus was the same fragile structure that had caused problems before. It was capital gains. It was stock market wealth. It was the temporary boom of a very specific moment in economic history. And now, as we move through 2025, that moment is over. The tech sector has contracted. Layoffs have swept through Silicon Valley. IPOs have slowed to a trickle. Venture capital has pulled back. And the wealthy individuals who were generating those massive tax bills are either seeing their incomes drop or, in some cases, they're leaving the state entirely. This brings us to the migration issue, which is one of the most politically charged topics in California right now. For years, people have been talking about the California exodus. Conservative media has trumpeted stories of U-Haul shortages and Tesla moving its headquarters to Texas. Progressive analysts have pushed back, pointing out that California's population remained relatively stable and that the losses were overstated. Both sides had valid points. Yes, some people were leaving, particularly middle-class families priced out of the housing market and retirees looking for lower costs of living. But California was still attracting immigrants from other countries and young professionals drawn to the tech industry. The net effect was a kind of churn rather than a collapse. But what's happening now is different, and it's more concerning for the state's fiscal health. It's not just that people are leaving, it's who is leaving. High earners, the exact individuals who contribute disproportionately to the state's tax base, are increasingly choosing to relocate. Some are moving to states with no income tax like Texas, Florida, Nevada, or Washington. Others are simply declaring residency elsewhere while maintaining business interests in California. The reasons vary. Some cite the high cost of living, others point to crime and quality of life concerns in major cities, and many are motivated purely by taxes. When you're earning millions of dollars a year and you can save hundreds of thousands just by changing your legal residence, the incentive is obvious. California has tried to address this with aggressive enforcement. The Franchise Tax Board, which handles state taxes, has become increasingly sophisticated at tracking residency. They look at where you spend your time, where your family lives, where your cars are registered, even where your gym membership is. They've gone after celebrities, athletes, and business owners who claim to have moved but still spent significant time in California, and they've won cases clawing back millions in disputed taxes. But this kind of enforcement has a chilling effect. It sends a message that California isn't just taxing you heavily, it's also going to scrutinize your life if you try to leave. That's not exactly a welcoming signal to entrepreneurs and investors. Meanwhile, the state's spending obligations keep growing. California has some of the most generous public employee pensions in the country, and those pension systems are underfunded by tens of billions of dollars. Every year, the state has to contribute more just to keep the system solvent, and those contributions are essentially locked in. You can't just decide to cut pension payments when revenue drops. The same is true for Medi-Cal, California's Medicaid program, which covers roughly 1 in 3 residents. Healthcare costs keep rising, and the state keeps expanding coverage. There's also K-12 education, which is guaranteed a certain percentage of the budget under Proposition 98, a voter-approved measure that ties education funding to overall state revenue. When revenue was high, that formula worked great. Now that revenue is falling, the state still has to maintain those funding levels, which means cuts have to come from elsewhere. And that's where things get really difficult, because the discretionary parts of the budget, the areas where cuts are actually possible, are relatively small. You're talking about things like higher education, parks, environmental programs, and social services that aren't federally mandated. These are often the most visible and politically sensitive areas. Cutting university funding means higher tuition and reduced access. Cutting environmental programs undermines the state's climate goals. Cutting social services affects the most vulnerable populations. Every choice is painful, and every choice generates intense political backlash. Governor Newsom has been trying to thread this needle, and it's not going well. He's proposed a mix of cuts, deferrals, and accounting maneuvers to close the deficit, but the numbers keep getting worse. Legislative analysts have warned that the problem extends beyond the current budget year. They're projecting deficits for the foreseeable future unless something fundamental changes. Either revenue needs to increase significantly, or spending needs to be dramatically reduced, or some combination of both. But increasing revenue in a state with some of the highest taxes in the nation is politically fraught. Raising income taxes could accelerate the exodus of high earners. Raising sales taxes hits lower and middle-income families harder. Property taxes are limited by Proposition 13, another voter initiative that's considered almost untouchable in California politics. So the state is stuck in a bind. The progressive coalition that dominates California politics wants to maintain and expand social programs, environmental protections, and workers' rights. The business community and moderate Democrats want fiscal stability and policies that keep the state competitive. And the Republican minority, though largely powerless in the legislature, keeps pointing to this situation as proof that Democratic governance leads to fiscal disaster. None of these groups can get what they want without compromise, but compromise has been in short supply. What makes this even more complicated is that California's problems aren't happening in isolation. The state's challenges reflect broader national trends. Housing affordability is a crisis across the country, not just in California. Income inequality has widened everywhere. The gig economy has disrupted traditional employment models nationwide. Federal policies on immigration, healthcare, and infrastructure affect what states can and can't do. California is dealing with all of these issues, but often in more extreme forms because of its size, diversity, and political ambitions. Take homelessness, for instance. California has roughly 30% of the nation's homeless population, despite being only 12% of the total U.S. population. The reasons are complex. The state's mild climate makes outdoor living survivable year-round. Housing costs have pushed people to the margins. Mental health and addiction services have been chronically underfunded. And despite spending billions on the problem, the visible crisis in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego has arguably gotten worse, not better. Voters see encampments on their streets. They see their tax dollars being spent, and they see no improvement. That breeds frustration and cynicism, which erodes support for the broader progressive agenda. Or consider crime. California voters passed Proposition 47 in 2014, which reclassified certain nonviolent crimes as misdemeanors rather than felonies. The goal was criminal justice reform, reducing incarceration, and saving money on prisons. But in practice, many people believe it led to an increase in property crime because the consequences became less severe. Whether the data fully supports that narrative is debatable, but the perception is powerful. Voters in both liberal and conservative areas have expressed concern about retail theft, car break-ins, and a general sense that enforcement has become too lax. In 2024, voters approved Proposition 36, which rolled back some of the changes from Prop 47 and increased penalties for repeat offenders. That vote happened in deep blue California, and it passed by a wide margin, suggesting that even progressive voters have limits when it comes to certain policies. All of this feeds into a larger question about California's future. Is the state sustainable on its current path, or does something have to give? The optimistic view is that California has faced crises before and emerged stronger. The state has enormous advantages, including world-class universities, a highly educated workforce, unmatched access to venture capital, and a culture of innovation that continues to attract talent from around the world. The pessimistic view is that the state is overextended, overregulated, and increasingly hostile to the very businesses and individuals who fund its ambitious agenda. The reality is probably somewhere in between, but the trajectory matters. If California continues to lose high earners and businesses while maintaining high levels of spending, the math eventually stops working. You can't fund a government designed for 50 million people with a tax base that's shrinking. You can't promise generous benefits and services if the revenue to pay for them isn't there. And you can't keep raising taxes on the people who remain without driving even more of them away. This is the trap that California is walking into, and it's not clear how the state gets out of it without making some very difficult choices. One possibility is that California doubles down on its current model, betting that the economic cycle will turn and revenue will rebound. If tech stocks recover, if AI drives a new boom, if capital gains surge again, the state could find itself flush with cash just like it was a few years ago. But that's a gamble, and it doesn't solve the underlying structural problem. Another possibility is that California shifts toward more sustainable fiscal policies, building larger reserves, constraining spending growth, and reforming pension and healthcare obligations. But that would require political will that hasn't been evident so far. A third possibility is that the federal government steps in with aid, either through direct transfers or by taking on more responsibility for programs that states currently fund. But with federal deficits also mounting, that seems unlikely. What seems most probable is that California will muddle through with incremental adjustments, cutting here, raising fees there, using accounting tricks to defer costs, and hoping that nothing breaks catastrophically. That's not a strategy, it's just survival. And for a state that prides itself on leadership and innovation, it's a disappointing place to be. The people who live in California, who pay some of the highest taxes in the nation, deserve better than a government that lurches from crisis to crisis. They deserve honest conversations about trade-offs, realistic assessments of what's possible, and leaders willing to make tough decisions rather than just promising more of everything. Because here's the thing, California matters, not just to the 40 million people who live there, but to the entire country. California is a testing ground for policies that other states watch and sometimes adopt. It's an economic engine that drives innovation and growth nationally. And it's a symbol of what America can be at its best, diverse, ambitious, and forward-thinking. But symbols only work if the reality matches the rhetoric. Right now, the reality in California is messy, uncertain, and increasingly difficult to defend. That should concern everyone, regardless of where they live or what they believe politically, because when California struggles, it affects us all.